Margaret Holloway was 82 years old, a woman whose life had been shaped by decades of quiet responsibility and unspoken endurance. Her daughter, Elaine Holloway, 46, had grown up inside that steadiness and learned to take it for granted. Elaine's son, Daniel Holloway, just 14, sat nearby that afternoon, old enough to understand tone and silence, young enough to still notice what adults chose to overlook. It almost always happens this way. Not with shouting or slammed doors, not with scenes dramatic enough to justify intervention, but with something smaller and far more dangerous. Comment delivered lightly. A smile held just long enough to disguise intent. A moment where everyone present feels a brief tightening in the chest and then decides, almost instinctively, that saying nothing will be easier. Most people can remember a time like that. A moment when disrespect appeared in plain sight and no one reached out to stop it, not because they agreed with it, but because stopping it would have felt awkward. That decision, made in a fraction of a second, is where the real fractures begin. The afternoon itself was unremarkable by design. A familiar American home filled with the quiet rhythm of routine, the kind of gathering that rarely surprises anyone. Midday light filtered through windows that had seen decades of similar occasions. Plates were arranged, voices were measured, movements were unhurried. Nothing about the setting suggested that anything meaningful was about to change. That sense of normalcy made what followed easier to overlook and harder to forget. The grandmother sat where she always did, her presence steady and unobtrusive. She was not introduced through sentiment or reverence, but through function. Years of accumulated responsibility lived in the way she occupied space without demanding it. Her authority did not announce itself. It had been earned quietly through paperwork completed on time, routines upheld without complaint, and sacrifices made without ceremony. She was the kind of person whose influence was felt more in systems than in conversations, more in continuity than in command. The daughter moved through the room with confidence shaped by familiarity. She knew the rhythms of this space and understood how far she could go without being challenged. When the mockery came, it arrived wrapped in humor, framed as something light enough to dismiss. It was not sharp or openly cruel. It carried the easy tone of someone who expected indulgence rather than resistance. The words themselves mattered less than the assurance behind them, the unspoken belief that nothing would come of it. For a brief moment the room stalled. No one reacted immediately. The comment landed and hovered, absorbed like background noise that people notice without acknowledging. Eyes flickered, smiles adjusted, posture shifted subtly. Controlled expressions replaced instinctive response. Polite nods and false concern filled the space where correction might have lived. It was not agreement, but it was not refusal either. The room chose to move on. Something felt off, and everyone sensed it. The discomfort did not erupt. It settled. The narrator's awareness lingered on that sensation, the quiet recognition that a line had been crossed without consequence. No one interrupted the flow of the gathering. No one challenged the moment directly. Silence began to carry more weight than confrontation ever could. The grandmother did not respond. She did not correct, defend, or withdraw. Her stillness was not resignation, but it was easy to misread as such. She adjusted nothing about her posture or expression. Years of endurance had taught her that not every moment required explanation. To those accustomed to louder forms of authority, her restraint appeared like absence. To those who understood systems, it was something else entirely. The moment passed outwardly. Conversation resumed. The rhythm returned. Laughter found its way back into the room with practiced ease. If someone had walked in late, they would not have known anything unusual had occurred. That was the most unsettling part. The damage did not announce itself. It settled into the fabric of the afternoon quietly, like a document placed carefully into a file that would not be opened immediately. This was not an emotional explosion. It was a record being made. No raised voices, no visible harm, no dramatic aftermath. Just a subtle shift that would be remembered long after the exact words faded. People often forget what was said, but they rarely forget the moment they chose silence. That memory has a way of returning later, heavier and clearer than expected. What made this moment different was not the mockery itself, but the way it was received. Comfort had been prioritized over correction, familiarity over accountability. In families, these choices accumulate. They teach lessons without ever stating them aloud. They show who can speak freely and who must absorb quietly. They reveal whose dignity is protected and whose is negotiable. As the gathering continued, most of the room adjusted and moved forward, relieved that nothing had escalated. But relief did not mean resolution. The moment had been noticed, even if it had not been addressed. Somewhere in the room, attention had not drifted back to plates or conversation. Someone had watched the exchange in full, without softening it or looking away. That awareness, still and unspoken, changed the weight of what had just occurred. The mockery ended. The smiles held. The afternoon carried on. Yet the moment itself did not disappear. It had been quietly logged, not by those who believed it inconsequential, but by someone unexpected, someone who understood that silence is never empty and that what goes unchallenged rarely stays contained. The strongest people often reach a point where they stop explaining themselves. Not because they lack answers, but because they have learned that explanation is rarely what restores balance. Many elders arrive there quietly, shaped by decades of choosing endurance over protest, consistency over recognition. Their strength becomes so familiar that others forget it was earned. In families, this kind of strength is frequently mistaken for absence, and silence is misread as surrender. The grandmother's life had been built in layers that did not announce themselves. Her days were marked by routine, not drama. Documentation mattered to her in ways that went unnoticed by those who benefited from it. Bills were paid on time without reminders. Appointments were kept, records filed, calendars updated. She carried responsibilities that rarely received acknowledgement because they worked so well that no one had to think about them. This was the architecture of her authority, invisible but essential, holding everything else upright. Years earlier, she had learned that reliability could be more powerful than persuasion. She did not argue systems into place. She maintained them until they became necessary. Her sense of order lived in small habits repeated over time, in the quiet assurance that tomorrow would be handled as carefully as yesterday. That was how she had survived changes that came without warning and losses that were never publicly mourned. Endurance had taught her restraint, and restraint had taught her timing. When the mockery occurred, her response followed the same logic. She did not react because reaction would have shifted attention away from what mattered. Silence in that moment was not submission. It was containment. She understood that some moments reveal more about the observer than the speaker, and she allowed the room to show itself. Her face remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. Nothing about her demeanor suggested collapse or retreat. To others, however, restraint looked like irrelevance. In a culture that often equates authority with volume, her quiet was misinterpreted as weakness. The daughter, accustomed to feedback and reinforcement, read the silence as permission. Without challenge, the moment felt resolved. That assumption rested on a misunderstanding that had been growing for years. The belief that nothing was happening unless it was visible. What went unnoticed was the way systems respond to consistency over time. The grandmother had never relied on confrontation to maintain her place. She relied on continuity. Even as the gathering moved forward, she returned to her routine without adjustment. Plates were cleared methodically. Notes were made where notes had always been made. Responsibilities were fulfilled with the same care they had received before. There was no emotional dumping, no visible pain, no appeal for understanding. Her life did not pause to acknowledge the slight, and that refusal carried its own authority. This was not indifference. It was discipline. She understood that moments like these did not require immediate resolution. They required memory. Systems remember even when people pretend not to. They remember patterns, reliability, and the absence of reaction as clearly as they remember disruption. By continuing unchanged, She allowed the moment to settle into the larger record of how things were handled and who could be trusted with influence. The daughter moved forward unaware of this ledger. In her experience, silence had always meant safety. It meant the issue was closed, the boundary flexible, the moment inconsequential. She did not notice how her confidence depended on the assumption that nothing would be revisited. That assumption was comfortable, and comfort has a way of dulling perception. The grandmother's restraint did not erase the event. It preserved it. By not defending herself, she kept the focus on what had been revealed rather than what could be argued. Her silence held the weight of a lifetime spent choosing which battles deserved energy and which deserved patience. She had learned that some truths unfold more clearly when left untouched. As the afternoon continued, others adjusted and moved on. The rhythm returned, the tension softened, and the room reclaimed its ease. To most, the moment had passed. But silence, when chosen deliberately, does not fade. It accumulates meaning. Wait. And while the gathering resumed its familiar shape, one person remained attentive, sensing that the stillness carried more than calm. That awareness lingered, heavy and unmistakable, signaling that the quiet had not been empty after all. People often confuse tolerance with approval, especially when no one speaks up to correct them. Over time, silence starts to feel like agreement, and unchecked behavior settles into routine. This is how entitlement rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive through defiance or open hostility, but through familiarity. It grows quietly in spaces where boundaries were once present but never enforced. The daughter had lived inside that quiet for so long that she no longer recognized it as silence at all. She moved through the family system with ease, confident in her footing because nothing had ever shifted beneath her. The structure around her had always adjusted to accommodate her tone, her timing, her comfort. Expectations bent subtly in her favor, not because anyone declared them flexible, but because no one resisted when they were tested. She learned early that confidence carried weight, especially when paired with politeness. That lesson stayed with her, shaping how she spoke and how she behaved when attention turned her way. Her mockery was not new. It had simply reached a point where it could surface openly without fear of consequence. It followed a familiar pattern, almost procedural, delivered with a casual rhythm that suggested repetition. There was nothing explosive about it, nothing that demanded an immediate response. That was precisely why it worked. The absence of reaction had always reassured her. Each unchallenged moment confirmed that the line had not only been crossed but quietly erased. Polite smiles surrounded her, acting as insulation. Performative concern softened the edges of what she said, making it easier for others to ignore the discomfort it caused. She understood the language of social ease well. It allowed her to dismiss any tension as misunderstanding rather than responsibility. Within that framework, accountability felt unnecessary. If no one objected, there was nothing to correct. She believed authority belonged to those who spoke with certainty and volume, those who filled space confidently. That belief had been reinforced repeatedly. The environment rewarded presence over patience, assertion over restraint. Silence, in her experience, had always meant acceptance. It signaled that whatever had been said was permissible, perhaps even expected. Over time, she stopped listening for feedback altogether. The family system had trained her carefully, though unintentionally. Every time discomfort was avoided, every time correction was postponed, the message grew clearer. She was safe to continue. The structure held, and she assumed it always would. That assumption became part of her identity. She did not see herself as dismissive or cruel. She saw herself as honest, comfortable, unburdened by unnecessary caution. There was no screaming in her behavior, no overt malice. Dismissal arrived wrapped in humor, softened enough to pass as harmless. That subtlety made it harder to challenge and easier to excuse. It allowed her to believe she was still operating within acceptable bounds. Without resistance, she felt validated. When the moment with the grandmother passed without interruption, it confirmed everything she believed. The lack of correction registered as closure. In her mind, the moment had ended cleanly. The gathering moved on, and so did she. There was no sense of guilt tugging at her, no internal reckoning. Why would there be? Silence had always been her shield. What she did not recognize was that systems do not rely on confrontation to recalibrate. They respond to patterns. They shift quietly, adjusting access, influence, and trust without explanation. The daughter had grown accustomed to immediate feedback, to visible reactions that signaled when something mattered. The absence of those signals convinced her that nothing had changed. She continued as before, unaware that comfort can be misleading. Familiarity had dulled her awareness of consequence. She mistook stability for permanence, tolerance for endorsement. The confidence she carried felt earned, but it rested on assumptions that had never been tested. That was the danger of growing comfortable inside unchallenged systems. When change comes, it rarely announces itself. As the afternoon settled back into routine, she felt no reason to reflect. The moment seemed complete, resolved by silence and movement forward. She believed the space had absorbed it and released it just as it always had. But beneath that calm surface, something had begun to shift. The structure she relied on had noticed. The record had been updated. And while she assumed the moment was over, the process it triggered had only just started. Most harm is not caused by cruelty. It is allowed by silence. It takes shape in rooms where everyone notices what just happened and quietly agrees that addressing it would be inconvenient. Silence in those moments is not accidental. It is a collective decision, made quickly and without discussion, justified by the desire to keep things smooth. That decision settled over the room now, as tangible as the furniture, shaping how each person held themselves in the seconds that followed. Every family member present felt the shift, though each named it differently in their own mind. One told themselves it was not their place to intervene. Another decided it was better not to make a scene. Someone else believed the moment would pass if left untouched, that drawing attention to it would only make it worse. These justifications moved silently, passing from thought to thought, forming a quiet consensus without a single word exchanged. No one could claim they had missed what happened. Eyes had lifted. Breathing had paused. The room had registered the mockery clearly. And still no one stepped forward. The absence of action was not confusion. It was calculation. Correction felt heavier than tolerance, and so tolerance won. The gathering continued because continuing was easier than confronting the discomfort that had briefly surfaced. Silence began to function as protection, but not the kind that preserves dignity. It protected convenience, familiarity, and the illusion of harmony. By saying nothing, the room shielded itself from tension. That protection came at a cost, though it was not immediately visible. Each unchallenged moment subtly reinforced the idea that certain behavior was acceptable, even expected. Silence became the structure holding that idea in place. The grandmother remained composed throughout it all. Her stillness was steady, unreactive, grounded in years of understanding how quickly rooms choose the path of least resistance. She did not seek acknowledgement or reassurance. Her posture did not shift to demand attention. She allowed the moment to exist as it was, trusting that its meaning would not be lost simply because it went unspoken. The daughter, meanwhile, moved forward with confidence untouched. The room's silence confirmed what she already believed, that the comment had landed safely, that no boundary had been crossed. Her ease grew from the absence of resistance. In her experience, silence had always functioned as endorsement, and this moment was no different. The lack of correction strengthened her certainty. Around them, others adjusted their expressions and resumed familiar roles. Conversations restarted. Small gestures filled the space where confrontation might have lived. The room reassembled itself, choosing continuity over clarity. That choice felt harmless on the surface, almost responsible. After all, nothing had escalated. No one was openly upset. Peace, however fragile, had been preserved. What the room failed to recognize was how neutrality operates. Neutrality does not freeze power where it is. It nudges it quietly in one direction. By refusing to intervene, the room favored the loudest presence, the one most willing to occupy space without apology. Silence tilted the balance, rewarding confidence and sidelining restraint. This pattern had repeated itself often enough to feel normal. The moment was filed away, not emotionally, but procedurally. Like paperwork completed without discussion, it entered the record without commentary. Nothing spoken, everything recorded. Systems work that way. They do not need acknowledgement to remember. They catalog behavior, responses, and omissions alike, building patterns that eventually shape outcomes. As time stretched on, the choice to remain silent hardened into precedent. Each person in the room had contributed to it, even those who felt uneasy. The discomfort they swallowed did not disappear. It simply went underground, where it would influence future decisions without ever announcing itself. Silence had done its work efficiently, leaving no visible trace of conflict behind. Yet silence does not erase awareness. It only redistributes it. While most of the room disengaged, relieved to move past the moment, attention did not vanish entirely. Concentrated. One person remained present in a way that others were not, observing the exchange and the reaction to it with careful focus. This attention was quiet, deliberate, and patient. The room believed it had chosen comfort and restored order. In truth, it had revealed something far more consequential. It had shown who would be protected by inaction and who would be left to absorb it. It had demonstrated how easily respect could be negotiated away for the sake of ease. And while most participants accepted that arrangement without further thought, one individual did not let the moment dissolve. As conversations drifted and the gathering resumed its familiar shape, that awareness remained fixed. The silence that everyone else relied on began to carry weight. It lingered not as absence but as pressure. One person in the room refused to disengage, holding on to the moment as something unfinished, something that would not be forgotten simply because it had not been addressed. Children learn far more from what adults ignore than from anything adults explain. Lessons delivered indirectly tend to last longer, settling quietly into memory without resistance. On that afternoon, while the room worked to smooth itself over, the grandson remained still, absorbing not only what had been said, but what had been allowed. His understanding began there, not as judgment but as awareness. He was introduced into the moment not through action, but through attention. He did not shift in his seat or search for distraction. There was no outward reaction to draw notice. His posture remained neutral, his expression unreadable, yet his focus sharpened. He watched the grandmother first, noticing the steadiness that did not waver. He observed how her composure held, how her silence did not collapse under the weight of the moment. There was something instructive in that restraint, something that suggested intention rather than absence. His attention then moved to the daughter. He noticed the ease with which she continued, the confidence that seemed to grow when no one objected. He registered how comfort followed silence, how quickly the room rearranged itself around her certainty. The grandson did not label this behavior as wrong or right. He simply recorded it. Watching, for him, was not an act of judgment. It was an act of learning. Finally, his awareness widened to include the room itself. He took in the collective response, the subtle recalibration of expressions, the quiet decision to proceed as though nothing had happened. He noticed how easily discomfort was traded for convenience, how quickly attention shifted away from the source of unease. These observations formed connections in his mind, linking action to reaction, silence to outcome. His own silence mirrored the grandmother's, but for a different reason. Where hers came from experience and restraint, his came from curiosity and patience. He did not yet know what the moment would mean, only that it mattered. Something within him recognized that speaking would change the shape of what he was witnessing. By staying quiet, he allowed the pattern to reveal itself fully. There was no sense of urgency in him, no need to intervene or correct. Instead, an internal resolve took shape gradually. He would watch and wait. He would pay attention to what happened next, and to what did not happen at all. This was not passivity. It was preparation. The long game begins not with action but with understanding. As the gathering resumed its familiar rhythm, the grandson continued to observe without drawing focus. His attention lingered on small details others overlooked. How routines resumed, how authority seemed to settle back into place, how the grandmother's presence remained unchanged while the room's energy subtly shifted around her. These details mattered to him because they told a larger story about how influence moved quietly through systems. He sensed that the moment had not ended simply because conversation resumed. It had been absorbed into something larger, something ongoing. This awareness did not trouble him. It grounded him. He felt no impulse to resolve the tension immediately. Instead, he accepted that some moments require time to reveal their significance. Patience, he understood instinctively, was part of comprehension. The grandson's watching carried a kind of respect. He did not reduce the grandmother's silence to weakness or dismiss the daughter's confidence as harmless. He held both realities at once, allowing them to coexist without forcing resolution. This capacity to tolerate complexity marked a quiet shift within him. He was no longer merely present. He was attentive in a way that would shape how he remembered the day. As time passed, he noticed how his own role in the room felt different. He was no longer just a participant in the gathering. He had become a witness. That distinction mattered. Witnessing did not require commentary or reaction. It required clarity. By remaining still, he preserved that clarity, protecting it from being diluted by distraction or reassurance. The adults around him believed the moment had faded into the background, another minor interaction absorbed by routine. The grandson understood otherwise. He felt the weight of what had gone unaddressed and recognized that unaddressed moments have a way of returning later, clearer and more instructive than when they first appear. He did not yet know how this understanding would shape him, only that it would. His memory of the afternoon began to solidify, not around words, but around dynamics. He would remember who held their ground without speaking, who moved forward without reflection, and who chose comfort over correction. These impressions settled deeply, forming a reference point he would return to in future moments when silence and action competed for space. As the gathering drew on, his watching did not waver, sharpened. What began as quiet attention transformed into something more durable. He was no longer just observing the present. He was storing it. The act of watching had turned into remembering, and that remembering would not fade. It would remain intact, ready to inform decisions yet to come, long after the room believed the moment had passed. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They do not demand attention or insist on being recognized. More often, they gather quietly, accumulating in the background while life appears unchanged on the surface. This is how systems protect themselves from chaos. They adjust without spectacle, recording patterns instead of punishing moments. By the time change becomes visible, the cause has already faded from memory. Time moved forward without confrontation. Days passed, then weeks, marked by ordinary routines and predictable rhythms. The daughter continued as she always had, carrying herself with the same confidence, speaking with the same ease. Nothing in her immediate world suggested a shift. She remained comfortable, certain that the moment she had dismissed truly belonged to the past. Without challenge, she saw no reason to reassess herself or her place within the family structure. The grandmother, too, continued unchanged. Her days remained steady, anchored by habits formed long before this incident. She handled responsibilities with the same care and patience, her reliability unwavering. There was no visible withdrawal, no subtle protest woven into her behavior. She did not reference the moment or seek acknowledgement for enduring it. Her consistency was its own statement, though it was easy to overlook precisely because it never wavered. What changed first were toggle, the grandson's attention sharpened further as time passed. He began to notice patterns that others ignored. He observed how certain decisions were made without discussion, how access to information shifted subtly, how trust expressed itself through quiet gestures rather than declarations. These were not dramatic changes. They were slight recalibrations, easy to miss unless one was looking carefully. Authority began to drift away from noise. It did not collapse or relocate suddenly. It softened in one place and settled more firmly in another. Voices that once filled the room carried a little less weight. Presence that had been taken for granted now required more effort to sustain. Meanwhile, restraint gained influence without calling attention to itself. The system responded not to what had been said, but to how it had been handled. Access adjusted quietly. Invitations changed tone. Responsibilities were reassigned without explanation. Information moved through different channels, guided by reliability rather than confidence. Trust, once freely extended, became more selective. None of this was framed as consequence. There were no meetings to address behavior, no conversations meant to clarify expectations. The shifts occurred as part of the system's natural self-correction. Routines absorbed the changes seamlessly. What had once felt automatic now required confirmation. What had been assumed now needed justification. The daughter sensed these adjustments but could not trace them to a specific cause. She felt the absence of ease before she recognized the absence of influence. The familiar responsiveness she relied on no longer arrived on cue. Doors that had always been open felt heavier, slower to move. The ledger that recorded these changes remained invisible. It did not assign blame or articulate judgment. It simply reflected patterns over time, responding to consistency and restraint. Systems function this way because they prioritize stability. They remember who preserves balance and who disrupts it, even when disruption is subtle and disguised as humor. The record does not need to be read aloud to take effect. The grandson watched this process unfold with growing clarity. He recognized that consequences were not punishments but outcomes. They did not correct behavior directly. They altered the environment around it. This understanding deepened his patience. He saw how timing mattered, how restraint allowed truth to surface without force. The long game revealed itself not as strategy, but as alignment with how systems naturally restore equilibrium. The daughter, however, felt disoriented. She could sense loss without identifying its source. The comfort she once enjoyed thinned gradually, leaving uncertainty in its place. She questioned outcomes rather than assumptions, looking outward for explanations that did not exist. Without confrontation, there was nothing to defend against, nothing to argue with. The absence of clarity unsettled her more than direct criticism ever would have. Meanwhile, the grandmother remained steady. Her role unchanged because it had never depended on reaction. Her authority was embedded too deeply to be shaken by a single moment. It was reinforced now by the system's response, though she neither sought nor acknowledged that reinforcement. Her focus stayed on continuity, on maintaining the structure that allowed everything else to function. As weeks turned into months, the adjustments became normalized. What once felt like a shift now felt like the way things had always been. The system completed its work quietly, leaving no obvious trail. The ledger remained unseen, its entries unspoken. Only those paying close attention could sense its influence. The daughter stood at the edge of this realization, aware that something had changed but unable to locate the moment when it began. She searched for a turning point that had never announced itself. The discomfort lingered, unresolved, as she sensed loss without understanding its origin. The system offered no explanation, only results, and those results continued to unfold with calm inevitability. Real power rarely announces itself. It does not demand recognition or arrive with force. It moves quietly, often unnoticed until its effects can no longer be ignored. This was the kind of power that began to shift now, not through confrontation but through absence. What changed was not dramatic enough to provoke alarm. Yet it was persistent enough to reshape the landscape of the family's dynamics. The daughter felt it first as a subtle resistance. Conversations that once flowed easily now seemed to stall. Decisions that had previously bent in her direction required more effort, more explanation. It was not rejection but delay. Not denial but distance. The responsiveness she had come to expect thinned gradually, leaving her unsettled. She could not point to a single incident or conversation that explained the shift. Nothing had been said. Nothing had been clarified. And yet, the difference was undeniable. Systems stopped responding to her in the same way. Access that once felt automatic became conditional. Influence that had gone unquestioned now required reinforcement. The change did not feel punitive. It felt procedural. The structure around her adjusted, as if following rules she had never noticed before. Without explanation, she was left to interpret outcomes without context. The lack of clarity made the experience more disorienting than any direct confrontation could have. No one explained the change because explanation was unnecessary. Systems do not justify themselves. They respond. The recalibration unfolded with calm efficiency, leaving no trace of intention behind it. The daughter searched for acknowledgement, for a moment where someone would articulate what she had done wrong or how she might correct it. That moment never came. Silence remained consistent, offering no guidance and no defense. Through all of this, the grandmother's position remained intact. Her role did not expand or contract, simply endured. She continued to move through her routines with the same measured confidence, unaffected by the shifts around her. Her authority had never depended on visibility, and so it was untouched by the redistribution of influence. What she had built over years of restraint and reliability held steady, reinforced quietly by the system's response. The grandson noticed the change long before anyone acknowledged it. He recognized the pattern as it formed, understanding that power was relocating rather than disappearing. He saw how silence had completed its work, how restraint had outlasted confidence. There was no sense of triumph in his awareness, no desire to claim understanding. He observed with the same patience that had guided him from the beginning. No victory speeches followed. There was nothing to celebrate openly. The shift did not belong to anyone in particular, and it did not require acknowledgement to be real. It existed in the way decisions were made, in who was consulted, in whose presence carried weight without effort. Power settled where it could function without disruption, guided by stability rather than assertion. The daughter felt the loss more acutely as time passed. What unsettled her most was the absence of conflict. There was nothing to argue against, nothing to push back on. Without confrontation, she was left alone with uncertainty. The familiar strategies she relied on offered no leverage against silence. The system did not resist her. It simply moved around her. The grandmother remained a constant point of reference, her composure unchanged. She did not react to the shift because she had never depended on reaction. Her restraint continued to signal a kind of authority that did not need reinforcement. It was this steadiness that the system recognized and preserved, not as reward but as necessity. The grandson's understanding deepened as he watched. He saw that lasting power did not require validation or recognition. It functioned best when it was least visible. This realization did not harden him. It grounded him. He learned that patience was not passive, and silence was not empty. They were tools that shaped outcomes over time, without ever drawing attention to themselves. As the family settled into this new arrangement, the shift became normalized. What once felt like change began to feel inevitable. The system completed its recalibration quietly, leaving behind a sense of order that no one could trace to a single moment. Silence had done what confrontation could not. It had moved power without warning. The grandson recognized the significance of this truth. He understood that the kind of power that lasts is rarely claimed. It is inherited through observation, reinforced through restraint, and sustained through timing. As he held on to this understanding, He knew it would guide him long after the moment itself faded. Power, he realized, was not something to seize or declare. It was something to recognize when it arrived quietly and chose to stay. The future rarely belongs to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to those who learn how to watch without flinching, how to stay present without needing to be seen. Patience, when practiced long enough, becomes a kind of vision. It allows meaning to surface slowly, without force. This was the lesson taking shape now, not through instruction but through lived experience. The grandson did not inherit authority in any formal sense. No role was handed to him. No responsibility was announced. What he received was quieter and far more durable. He inherited understanding. He learned how moments settle into systems, how silence can signal strength rather than absence, and how timing often matters more than reaction. This understanding did not elevate him above anyone else. It anchored him. Respect, he came to see, outlived mockery. The comment that had once felt sharp lost its immediacy, while the grandmother's restraint continued to resonate. Her silence did not fade with time. Gained weight. It became reference rather than memory, a steady point against which other behavior was measured. Without ever being named, it set the standard. Systems remembered that restraint. They always do. They preserve what stabilizes them and distance themselves from what introduces imbalance. The grandson watched as this memory expressed itself quietly, shaping outcomes without explanation. He recognized that nothing had been erased, only reordered. The absence of confrontation had not erased consequence. It had refined it. The grandmother's silence became something larger than a single response, transformed into legacy. Not a story told or a lesson delivered, but a pattern demonstrated consistently over time. She continued her life unchanged, and that continuity became instructive. It showed how dignity could be maintained without defense, how self-respect did not require permission. Her example settled into the fabric of the family, influencing decisions long after the moment itself slipped from conversation. The daughter faced consequences that were clean and irreversible, though never dramatic. They did not arrive as punishment. They arrived as reality. Influence diminished. Access narrowed. Familiar ease did not return. There was no path back to what had been assumed permanent. The absence of confrontation left no space for negotiation. What was lost stayed lost, not as revenge but as result. Systems had adjusted, and systems rarely reverse without reason. There was no celebration in this outcome. No satisfaction drawn from another's loss. The tone of the family remained calm, almost gentle. That calm carried a quiet firmness now, shaped by lessons learned without being discussed. The silence that once felt uncomfortable had grown authoritative. It no longer needed to be explained or defended. It simply existed, shaping the environment around it. The story ended where it began, with silence. But this silence was different. It was no longer passive or uncertain. Carried intention. It had been tested and proven. It held memory and consequence together without raising its voice. Those who had once relied on silence to avoid discomfort now felt its weight more clearly. No longer protected convenience. Preserved order. The grandson felt this shift deeply, though he never spoke of it. His attentiveness matured into something steadier, more grounded. He understood that observation was not hesitation, and patience was not delay. They were forms of participation that shaped outcomes without demanding credit. This understanding did not make him distant. It made him careful, empathetic, and precise. He carried with him the knowledge that moments others overlook often define the future. That what feels small at the time can become foundational later. The detail he noticed that afternoon, the one no one else documented, remained vivid. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed how people choose, how systems respond, and how silence can speak more clearly than words. The family moved forward, shaped by adjustments few could trace back to their origin. Life resumed its rhythm, steadier now, more deliberate. The lesson embedded itself quietly, influencing behavior without demanding acknowledgement. This was how true inheritance worked. It did not announce itself. Endured. The grandson never looked away. That choice, made without drama, became his quiet compass. One day, without warning or declaration, others would notice his steadiness, his patience, his ability to see clearly when others rushed past meaning. When that day came, they would not point back to this moment. They would simply recognize the presence of something solid. And when they finally looked to him, it would be because he had been watching all along.